I'd like to turn it over to Kristján on that note. So David Krieger, I see you have your hand raised. Could you please enter your question in the chat or the Google Doc, and we'll see if we can get to it within the session. And otherwise, I will turn it over to Kristján. And Kristján has posted a document in the chat that he's going to be referring to for the following discussion. So,
yeah, thanks, Mike. Well, thank you all. So Mike asked me to maybe summarize the presentations in the symposium and structure the discussion about them a bit. I don't really think I need to summarize them. I think all these presentations were extremely clear and lucid and don't really stand in need of any further sort of summary. So I will instead sort of try to bring the discussion a bit more in a kind of a historical and cultural direction. So historically, I mean, the debate about the relationship between individual and collective well-being is obviously 2,300 years old, and it dates back to Aristotle. He was the first scholar, the first academic to sort of talk about this in any detail, and the tension possibly between individual and collective well-being. Unfortunately, for what happened later, he wrote about this in two separate books. He wrote about it in his ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics, on the one hand, about individual well-being and about individual practical wisdom of phronesis and how to develop that in the individual within the family and the in-group, the small group. And then he wrote another book, The Politics, about collective well-being and managerial phronesis and how rulers should sort of be educated and the need for rulers to think about the well-being of everybody rather than just the individual group or the family. What Aristotle said again and again is that you need to read both these books. He said you need to read them in a certain order, because obviously when you're a child, you sort of think about well-being just in relation to yourself and your family, your friends. When you become a bit older, an adult, then you move on to sort of more collective and political issues. But he said, but you need to read both of them. And he thought of them as a kind of a sandwich treatise about the individual and the collective. So what happened historically, and this is very unfortunate, is that these two works sort of caused a kind of a split in the academic world. Through various intermediaries, the Nicomachean Ethics laid the foundation of discourses in psychology, about personality psychology, in philosophy, about virtue ethics, in education, about character education, which are very much individually oriented. And then the Politics, again, through various intermediaries, led to sort of fields like social psychology, in education, to citizenship or civic education, and to things like game theory and political theory. So this split happened around the Enlightenment, this split between this focus on the individual well-being, which was studied in certain fields of study, and the study of collective political well-being in other areas, which is extremely unfortunate. So why did this split happen? So I want to refer to the book I posted in the chat, which is the book by Owen Flanagan called The Geography of Morals. So Owen Flanagan thinks that the split happened because actually, if you look at the research that's being done on individual and collective well-being since the Enlightenment and to the present day, more than 90% of it is conducted and written by people that Owen calls weird, namely Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So there is a very, very strong bias in the writings and in the research sort of towards Western individualism. Now, you might want to say, well, but actually more and more of this is being researched and written about in countries like Taiwan or China or Japan. But Owen points out that actually, if you look at the provenance of the people who are conducting that research, most of them have got PhDs from the States or Britain, so they have already adopted a kind of an individualized, independent self-concept. So Owen's theory is that this unfortunate split, which is sort of reflected in the need to conduct research like we've been listening to today, about actually it's good for you if you think about your neighbor, if you talk to other people, or if you do good deeds. So he thinks that this is caused by two assumptions, which are uniquely Western and modern. One is the ontological assumption of an independent self-concept, that our self-concept is independent from that of other people, and that each person is an island. And then the moral assumption would be sort of rational egoism, that in the end, I mean, it just stands to reason that everything we do ultimately must be for our own personal good. But Owen argues in this book that these two assumptions are, like I said, sort of uniquely weird. They're uniquely confined to our part of the world and the people who sort of tend to attend academic conferences and conduct research which is published in good journals. So he thinks that a lot of the research that people are devoting attention to about the relationship between individual and collective well-being is dealing in sort of, or trading in pseudo problems, or problems that would be considered to be bizarre for people in the ancient world or the medieval world, or even people outside of these weird cultures, as he calls them. So I would like to, I hope all the presenters are still around. I can see some of them, but not all of them, but I hope Ken is here, and Mila and Gillian and Will. So I would like to maybe to start this discussion by sort of posing the same question to all of them. To what extent do you think that the discourse that sort of we have been listening to today is historically conditioned by the presumption in favor of individualism, and in particular these two assumptions of ontological individualism and rational egoism? To what extent is this discourse uniquely conditioned by these assumptions? If Ken is around, I'd love to hear his take on this.
Yep, they're all here, so we could start with him.
I haven't thought about this very much, but I would agree that the questions that we ask and the concepts that we use are historically conditioned. You know, I like to think that you know, game theory and the cooperative exploitative dynamic maybe transcends that in some way, but I don't know that that's true. I guess I would ask, what would it look like if we came at it from the other perspective that you're suggesting we're ignoring? Because that's, I'm not quite clear about that.
Right, okay, maybe we can sort of discuss that later. Let's just hear from all of you first the response to this question. Mila.
And the question was that in terms of like individually focused stuff, right?
Yeah, to what extent is this research that's being done on individual and collective well-being sort of conditioned by sort of the assumption in favor of an independent self-concept and also sort of a rational, egoistic, moral assumption?
Yeah, I think that with the studies, especially that I've talked about, the one thing that I didn't even kind of mention that made it to the paper, but I just didn't have enough time to talk about, kind of in that study where we were looking at other well-being and we didn't find a correlation. I think that's where it becomes really relevant in terms of, we find that it doesn't even matter if you succeed at making others happy, it matters what you think. So it's very individual in that way, right? So it's kind of, well, we look at it from this individual perspective. So you're right that we are not kind of thinking about it in a different way, but we also find kind of support in our data that way the effect works is like, it doesn't matter if you actually succeeded at making somebody else's happiness happier, but it matters whether you think you succeeded. So, which is, I find it kind of like in a way ironic and weird. And it is definitely something that I think that future research need to look more into in terms of kind of more from this well-doing perspective. Is like, okay, but like, are you doing it for yourself or are you actually doing something for others? Like, what's your end goal? individual or kind of spreading some kind of well-doing and benefits for others.
Thank you. Gillian.
Hello. I mean, I don't even know how to answer your question. Obviously it's a universal need to connect. I would think it's a universal need to connect with other people. So, everybody in every place is going to need to talk to strangers. Are people going to worry about different things? Are they going to feel different ways after doing so? Surely that's true. I don't know what I don't know. I guess I don't really have more to say than that.
Okay, Will.
Thanks for liking me to unmute, Mike. That Zoom message is so funny. The host would like you to unmute. So, yeah, well, like Ken said, I think that the questions we ask, the methods we use are always historically conditioned, and that's something that's always going to be there. And I also want to hear, Kristján, some more on what you think how you think they might look differently from an outside perspective. I mean, I think what I try to do is I try to discover these pre-cognitive influences on my thinking. I try to be aware of them. I try to fight them when I feel like they're interfering with me identifying things. I try to listen to people when they tell me, I think you have a assumption you're making there that isn't quite as universal as you think it is. So that's sort of what I try to do to deal with that fact that is always there. I want to point out two kind of basic assumptions in my work that is in a lot of my work, including the work I presented today, that I get a lot of pushback on in the typical cultural atmosphere I present my work. And the first is Parfit's idea, who's a Western philosopher, no question about it. But he makes this very important point that it doesn't look like, and I think he's convincing, that there is a diachronic self, which is a core aspect of Buddhist philosophy as well. And so that there really is no person that exists over time. And that raises this whole question of why should you care about yourself at all, other than other people? Why do you have any interest? Like, we have this basic core assumption in our Western philosophy or Western culture that, obviously the default assumption is you're going to care for yourself, and then you have to have a reason to care for others. And Parfit kind of turns that on its head and says, well, actually, wait, you have no reason to care for yourself because there is no you. And so it just completely disappears the question. And I get a lot of pushback on that. People think that's crazy and absurd. And they just laugh at me. It's hard to even get them to talk to me about this. Fortunately, Parfit is well respected, so I can hide in that, get some refuge in that little enclave there. The second one I get a lot of pushback on is this finding that I think caring for others as much, in conversation or dialogue or balance with how much you care about yourself is healthy. That is, people are just automatically think, oh, that's ridiculous. That's unhealthy. That means you've sacrificed your own needs for some kind of perverted overemphasis on other people's needs. So again, that kind of, well, obviously people tell me, obviously we care more about ourselves than other people to a great degree. That's obviously the healthy thing. So those are just two little stories they're related to what you're saying.
Yeah, well, thanks. Well, I mean, just to return to Ken's question, what would sort of the opposite way of looking at these issues look like in practice? It's difficult for me to say because, I mean, I'm obviously also a member of a weird society. I mean, I am Western and industrialized and relatively rich, etc. So it's difficult for me to say. The research I've been doing, although that's been in philosophy rather than psychology, obviously sort of takes for granted some of these assumptions as well. So I may not be the best motivated person to answer that, but just to return to Owen Flanagan's book, which I strongly recommend, I mean, he would simply say that if you introduce the discourse about individual and collective flourishing or well-being to, let's say, a Buddhist or a Confucian thinker who wasn't sort of acquainted with his Western way of looking at things, they would find the whole sort of questions that are being explored in Western social science extremely weird. And for example, they wouldn't really understand the question of like, why would you sort of do something for your friend? Do you expect to get something in return? Because they would say, well, I mean, but the friend is just part of myself. And this was also an Aristotelian idea that he said that the good friend is another self. So the idea would be that in large parts of the world and in large periods of history, the kind of questions that we, I mean, and that includes me as well, are interested in would have sounded quite alien to people, and that's a big challenge. Is there anybody here from? There must be some people from sort of outside the weird world. Are there any Buddhists in the audience, or sort of Confucians, or people who sort of identify as having an interdependent self-concept rather than an independent self-concept, and would they want to make any comments about this discourse? Do they find this discourse weird, as Owen does?
Paul or Peter? Sorry.
Sure. I mean, my grandmother was Buddhist. I'm not sure I would say I'm Buddhist, but I was raised Buddhist. And so when I studied economics, I always thought it was weird when people talk about the rational self-interest and the self is so narrowly defined. And as you say, in Buddhism, at least the way I understood it from my grandmother, was everyone is part of you, and it's just concentric circles of bigger and bigger selves. And that includes not just humans, but other sentient beings. So that's why you are vegetarian or vegan. And so it's a very strange view that I think Western social science has taken. But I think you can just say self-interest, we just have to define a broader conception of self, which may include the planet Earth in Gaiaism. I'll just stop there.
Somebody else has raised their hand.
Yeah, I think that was the discussion about this. Even whether you call it from Buddhist perspective or going to proceeding to Buddhism, also some of the Indian tradition, whether it's Jainism or in Hindu tradition also, where when we compare this to the modern research which psychology is doing, and we were discussing in the LIS conference in some other context that psychology is becoming the data research for 2.0, somebody said. And because it is because the whole understanding of the self and also the lack of philosophical thoughts and the abstract philosophical thoughts which have not been undertaken. I can give one example in the field of my current research. It's in the field of mindfulness research, where we are struggling to capture the first person report of different stages of samadhis or Buddhist vipassana meditation, to give some objectivity at least. And my personal view is that it's because there is within the group of researchers, there is I should not say ignorance, but lack of understanding of the philosophical exposition when they conduct these research. So yeah, so definitely I think philosophy can really help psychology in that sense. That's what my view is as well, especially in my field.
Right. Well, this connects very well to the next theme I wanted to sort of bring up. I don't want to spend the whole session on sort of discussing independent versus interdependent conceptions of selfhood and in different cultures. I also want to discuss the issue of interdisciplinarity. So a lot of the questions that you brought up today, I mean, are questions which, although most of them have been researched within psychology, I mean, some of them have been researched within game theory, within economics, etc. And obviously, most of them have got a philosophical dimension as well. So I want to sort of ask the presenters to give their take on where they see the role of cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary research in all of this. We all know that most universities in the world have got the term interdisciplinarity written into the mission statements, but still in practice, it's quite difficult to get published, you know, when you write sort of truly cross-disciplinary papers, because the journal world is still very conservative. So to what extent do you think that progress in the area that you've been describing and talking about today would benefit from more interdisciplinary work? Ken?
Interdisciplinary work is always better, although it introduces new difficulties and challenges in understanding each other's perspectives. As this conversation has been going on, it's occurred to me that there's a sense in which we're now trying to get beyond our assumptions of individualism, and we're recognizing maybe what the Buddhists always knew, you know, and that's not the main thing. And so I'm not too worried about the limits in our science as we do this, because the science is now trying to directly deal with this issue in society. Yeah, so I guess I don't really see a bias based on weird in what we've been talking about here today, but maybe I'm missing it.
Thanks, Ken. Well, I see Brian Little has got his hand raised, so maybe we can sort of wait with hearing from Milan and Gillian, and Will, and just see what Brian has to say about either of these two questions we have been discussing. Brian, good to see you.
Yeah, I'd love to say a few words. First of all, about the whole session has been remarkably stimulating. This is one of the best sessions I've heard at any conference. It's breaking new ground. The young scholars are sensational. The old ones remain sensational, and I count some of my favorite intellectual pals in this group. So it's wonderful to see you all. Well done. And it's interesting that the term well doing seems to be doing well, much better than it did before the conference. I do have a specific question for Will that connects to the issue that Kristján has raised about weirdness. Will, I'm wondering if in your exploration of well-doing in Moral Heroes, if to invoke that image of Mrs. Jellyby who's looking to Africa and doesn't see the children falling down the stairs in her house, have you any evidence for or against the notion that those who see broad moral callings that infuse their life are less likely to have happy, convivial, supportive family relations? Is one price we pay for this level of moral breadth and impact a local microecological cost?
I just want to interject there real quick, kind of a scheduling issue. Do any of our presenters need to leave the conversation because we are at time as scheduled? No? Okay. And for everyone else, we now have a 25-minute break before anything else happens for the conference. So please, everyone, keep listening, keep interacting with this discussion as you please. And with that, sorry to interrupt.
Okay, yes, that was a good interruption, but unfortunately it knocked my answer out of my head. So I'm going to recreate it. So the question is, what is, it was an important interruption to do, Mike. I'm just justifying my pause here. So the question is there any evidence that people who are morally exceptional suffer by not taking care of their family or having good relationships with their family, like the Hair song? One of my favorite songs, you know, it's easy to be cruel.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So I think that I don't have any evidence one way or the other. That is certainly an idea that's out there. It's a hypothesis. The only, you know, sort of indirect evidence that I have that is not mine, but I've seen, is that people who are morally exceptional, wait a minute, I'm gonna modify what I just said in a second, but people who are morally exceptional tend to come from families with close attachments and loving relationships. So it's likely that they'll carry that through to their adult relationships, although who knows, maybe it interferes, they end up spending too much time on their cares for others. Of course, we had some presentations today and yesterday about relationships effects of doing good. So I think that there's seem like some positive effects there too, but I wish I could say more. I think that's an urgent question, Brian.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Right, so we've basically exceeded the time that was given to us, but I still want to sort of give Mila or Gillian or Will a chance to sort of respond to the question about cross-disciplinary research if they want to at the end. So obviously most of us are used to presenting our findings in sort of within a fairly narrow echo chamber of colleagues, but obviously a conference like this is much broader. You can see in this audience people coming from a very varied disciplinary background. Is that a blessing or a blessing or a burden? Does it help or does it hinder our work to have to present to discuss our findings to a very broad and varied audience? Any comments on this from Mila, Gillian, or Will to round this off?
I can say my 2 cents on that. I think that's really stimulating different views and viewpoints when you do interact with a more interdisciplinary audience. And Ken and Brian, we were both, 2 years ago now? We were at the small conference that was kind of intersecting philosophy and psychology. And I found it fascinating because that was my first experience in truly attending an interdisciplinary conference that was kind of designed to actually bring those both together. On the other hand, I think that also Ken mentioned a good point that sometimes you run into kind of maybe preferring different methodology and kind of approaching things in different ways that could be both an asset and a hindrance in those interdisciplinary projects. But with the topics that we were talking about today, I see connections to philosophy, I see connections to theology, I see connections to sociology. Like there's just so many different interdisciplinary aspects of those questions that I think could be really beneficial to explore despite those potential kind of hindrances or potential difficulties that might occur.
Right. Any further final thoughts from Gillian or Will?
Yeah, so as a softball, Kristján, because obviously I've spent the last 11 years working on interdisciplinary team on morality, so you know what I think. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna hit a foul ball by saying, I think interdisciplinary work is fantastic, but not in its own sake, not for its own sake. It's not good just because it's interdisciplinary. It's good because you get to find ideas out from different perspectives that really help you understand things better and give you a broader sense of what's relevant and what's important. So I really love it. I mean, philosophy, I just love philosophy. And so for me to be able to be working within a philosophy context is great. So.
Thanks. Well, on that note, I think I'll just thank you all and hand back over to Mike to sort of finish this session.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Thanks, Brian, for the high compliments on the session. We're certainly very grateful that we could have all these great people here and have such great discussion, including with the audience. For the presenters, if you're interested, and I hope you are, please follow up on the Google Doc. You've probably got some good engagement on there, judging by how this audience was. And with that, I'll just point out